to our second American Conversations lecture. And just want to remind you that this is a particularly dialogic event, so we have plenty of time for your questions, off-the-cuff comments, idle banter, that sort of thing afterwards. I want to begin introducing our speaker, Nicole Van Germeten, Associate Professor of History, with an anecdote. So 8 years ago, she and I were taking a course, or a training, I guess it was, in teaching in the writing intensive curriculum. And afterwards, we were unlocking our bikes. And I expressed to her some of my anxieties about teaching non-British colonial texts in the American Literature Survey. And particularly, I was worried about how the students would take our reading of Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz the next day. And Nicole, I said this to her, and she stops unlocking her bike. She stands up, she looks at me incredulously, and she says, "A colonial Mexican poet, feminist, lesbian nun? What's not to like?" Apart from her impressive ability to mollify the anxieties of a new faculty member, Nicole holds the PhD from UC Berkeley. In 2003 and 2004, she was a fellow at the Princeton Center for the Study of Religion, and a few years later, in 2008-09, was affiliated with the Stanford University Center for Latin American Studies. She's the author of 2 monographs, one, Black Blood Brothers, Confraternities and Social Mobility for Afro-Mexicans, that was 2006, and Violent Delights, Violent Ends, Sex, Race, and Honor in Colonial Cartagena de Indias. With support from a Fulbright Garcia Robles grant and from the American Philosophical Society, she's also published a translation and numerous articles on the topics of race, sexuality, and religion in Latin American history. Please welcome Nicole Van Germeten.
That anecdote was extremely terrifying. I had no idea
what
I might have said. Horrible quoted.
Oh, no, it's lovely.
All right, so in this presentation, and here's the title, I thought it'd be a good idea to just talk a little bit about my book that came out in November. So obviously I can talk with much greater authority on this topic and pursue any tangents that come up in that way. And then I'm also trying to start a new project that I have a lot less leg to stand on currently. So that's going to be really just kind of a little bit of guesswork and supposition at this stage, but eventually in 6 or 7 years, hopefully it'll be a completed one. So just bear with me in terms of what I have to offer on my new project. And I'm trying to use a different methodology, and that's where the title comes from. So this book, Violent Delights, Violent Ends, Sex, Race, and Honor in Colonial Cartagena de Indias, came out a few months ago, and it focuses on the rhetoric of honor and sexuality as used in judicial records that came before 3 branches of Spanish Crown Justice. I'll just give you a map of where Cartagena is located on the Caribbean coast of Mar de Colombia. It was in the Viceroyalty of Peru, and then later on they had a Viceroyalty based in Bogota as of 1740. So in Cartagena they had courts that were the ones that I used for my book. The provisor, the bishop's court, that would deal with any ecclesiastical matters or sacraments. They also had a tribunal locally of the Holy Office of the Spanish Inquisition. That was one of only 3 in the Americas at that time. And they, of course, had their secular criminal courts. And the time period that I covered was from the late 16th to the late 18th century. So I have to cover quite long periods of time because I have pretty limited source material available to me. The local archives didn't survive very well through the colonial period, unfortunately. So I used cases that could be found in Madrid through the National Archive there, which is the Holy Office cases. Seville is where you have the Archive of the Indies, which has a lot of the material that would have gone to the level of Spain, had been appealed or what have you, or decrees coming out of Spain. And then lastly, the National Archive in Bogota, which has a lot of the colonial-related material, cases that were appealed to the High Court there in Bogota. also have another image. Here's our image of Cartagena as a fortified city from about the 1600s, but here's a good image from the 18th century so you can get a sense of what it's like. There, it's a walled city. It was a port, one of the major ports. So it had a lot of the key Spanish institutions, although it was never a very large metropolis at any time in its history. And then here, you can go back to that map, but I just thought you might be wondering why I like that place so much. It may have something to do with the ambiance, you know. It's such an amazing, tropical, yet colonial place that's just so beautiful, and you can sit on a fortification going back to the late 16th century and look out to the beautiful Caribbean sea. It's 90 degrees every day of the year, with beautiful tropical weather and what have you. So music, people, everything you could want. So that's why this is a great place to work, although unfortunately you can't do the research there because there's no law. So, brief overview of this book is, which I'll flesh out a little bit more. I've looked at archival documents as representing an emotional performance, a rhetorical stance that positioned the producer within, the producer of the document, the speaker in the document, within the social, racial, and gender hierarchies of colonial Spanish America. The most prevalent way of establishing one's place in these hierarchies was by rhetorically invoking the honor code, enforcing this system while positioning oneself within it, either in a lowly victimized stance, which was very appealing for the paternalistic court structures, or in a strong exalted position, which was an important way to situate yourself if you wanted to say, I'm kind of above all these concerns and get off of an accusation. So you could have either of these poses, whether you were a witness or in the defensive position or in an adjudicating posture on the offensive. So in my book, I examined these testimonies for a clear understanding of what was expected in judicial rhetoric and how it may have conflicted with or actually hid more intimate and revealing aspects of colonial life, because the idea is this is rhetoric of the courts. It's not necessarily how everybody talked outside of the courts or what they felt. So I was especially interested in locating women's historic agency through the act of starting a judicial case, or at glimpses of the more exciting lives they lived that were very lightly veiled by the expected rhetoric of sexual passivity, seclusion, and victimization. So I thought this was a slightly better approach because generally, as my students in 407 can testify to, because we just read an article on Monday, so they could hopefully agree, that court documents, a lot of times for Latin America, are analyzed as if they portray some kind of true life presentation of what things were. So there's historians in my field, some of them seem to have a sort of a naive belief in some kind of accuracy of these judicial performances, or even vice-regal pronouncements from on high. So, for example, for my first project, I found it very disturbing that a lot of historians believed in the idea of the Afro-descended vagabond and criminal, because the viceroy said that. So historians assumed that that was the case, that those people were vagabond and criminals. You know, that seems sort of nonsensical to me. You know, we should question every statement that's made by anybody in this context, right? So in my next project, and what scholarship I do moving forward, I hope to take another step towards understanding written documents in the context of emotional history, to try to go a little bit deeper than just realizing that these are all rhetorical statements. So I refer to William Reddy's terms of a navigation of feelings in an emotional regime, and I'll get back to that. But in brief, taking one's personal problems before the judiciary or ending up on the defensive in a court situation indicates that an individual has mishandled the correct emotional regime, or he or she would not be in trouble, right? Or trying to appeal to the authorities, right? With the help of this methodology, I'm hoping to gain more insights into how men and women who appear before various kinds of colonial courts through their own missteps or mistakes, being in the wrong place at the wrong time, actually tell us about this society's inner workings, even its intimate secrets. So in this book here, I could not draw from a very well-developed historiography of sexuality for the colonial Americas. While historians for decades have argued that the crown of Spain could not possibly succeed in enforcing every decree, whether economically, socially, racially, or politically in their imperial ideology, in terms of sexuality and honor, historians insist that the honor code was absolutely supreme and unquestioned. So that's the one thing that succeeded, when everything else was, the famous phrase that I use in History 350 is, I obey but I don't comply. That was sort of their motto, obedezco pero no cumplo, right? So that's their entire attitude, right, in their system. So why should it be different in any walk of life? So that the idea is that the honor code reigns supreme as an effective source of behavioral control. And the key aspect of the honor code that I'm discussing here is the idea that men control female sexuality and punish indiscretions with violence, the stereotypical sexually aggressive macho. Historians have viewed male control of Spanish American female sexuality as triumphant, supported by studies of clerical treatises, which are definitely expert on female sexuality. Sporadic morality campaigns, which is always interesting to me because somebody will say, that they were extremely disciplinarian and they, prosecuted adultery constantly, but then they'll have like 3 examples in a 300-year time span. So that shows to me that they didn't care that much. And we just had a quote in our reading for Monday that said 44% of women lived in sin or what have you. So obviously that was pretty tolerated, right? And then also there's a few institutions scattered throughout the viceroyalties for wayward women. They call them recogimientos. And of course these exist as well as an example of the honor code succeeding in effect. So my idea is that the court cases don't necessarily show the honor code succeeding. It shows a rhetoric, right? Rhetorical gesture. That where the attempt is to reestablish social or gendered order by presenting an intimate or personal problem before the court, to reestablish the proper order, right? Which may or may not be what the person is actually saying. It could be something completely different. So I use the Natalie Zaman Davis's 1982 book, Fiction in the Archives, as an archival analysis that was very useful for this kind of thing, where you're thinking of the stories that people tell in judicial court cases, right? As well as actually historiography of early modern Spain is extremely good for offering many examples of strong female presences in the courts, and actually a powerful, long tradition of female sexual agency. That's quite well represented in the early modern Spanish historiography. So it's kind of odd that that can't be transmitted across the ocean to their empire, right? And a lot of female self-determination in that historiography is quite well recognized. So it seems that historians of Latin America prefer the macho victimization story to this point. And the history of the idea of the macho only goes back to the 19th century, actually. So it's a 19th century idea that may have had nothing to do with how people acted in the 1500s through 1700s, right? And this, of course, was greatly popularized by Octavio Paz in the mid-20th century as kind of an extremely grim, negative view of Mexican nationalism is where that derives from, right? Which is quite misogynistic, right? And of course, if we're thinking of men of the past in a stereotype of the Latin macho, we're still working within a very broad racial generalization, right? So obviously we don't want to do that, right? And then the other sort of ancestry of these attitudes is we have a lot of studies of honor going back to the 1950s in Spain, or the concept of Mediterranean honor, which is sort of taken from the point of view of Northern Europeans looking into Mediterranean honor codes as kind of a barbaric, extremely emotional, violent way of being a man, immature, right? So all of these ideas that feed into our belief in the macho being existed in the colonial Latin America, I think are pretty disputable and pretty biased. So I wanted to just look at a couple of cases in my book. So let's see if I turn that So we have different types of sex-related cases that came before the judiciary. And I think that if a woman brought a case before a judicial authority figure, her or her family, we're actually exercising great agency to take that step right there. For example, a breach of promise suit was very common in this era. And this means that a couple had a sexual relationship, but the man did not carry through on the marriage that allegedly he promised. So the woman and her family tried to force the marriage or some type of monetary compensation, such as child support if necessary, or money for a dowry, because they claimed the man seduced the woman under the promise of marriage. So in order to effectively present their case, the family would present the woman as a model of virginal innocence and purity. These could also be defloration cases, right? So if there's any doubt of the woman's purity and complete passivity, it's sort of impossible to do a defloration case, right? Because you can't do a defloration case if you can't be a deflower, right? So the idea was to portray the woman as passively as possible and the man as aggressively as possible. So I'll just read a statement that comes from a father, and it's quite interesting. They were doing this breach of promise case, and this father was actually a very absentee father. So it's kind of no surprise that his daughter got into trouble, so to speak, because he was never around to fulfill his duty as the guardian of the household. So this is the kind of verbiage that you would see by the father. I'm making a criminal complaint against Don Juan Ramirez, Alguacil Mayor, before your mercy. This would be, I guess, before the governor or the bishop. I say that in my house, my daughter, an honest and secluded maiden, in the company of her mother, my legitimate wife, was raised with great honor, virtue, and seclusion as the daughter of noble and important parents. She was commonly known as a maiden of good reputation. What happened was that the accused offender, with little fear of God or our Lord, added a great burden on his soul and conscience in disdain for royal justice. With the power and hand of a constable, which is what this guy's office was, should stimulate him to live an exemplary life and refrain from evil deeds. For 4 years solicited my daughter day and night. Whenever she went out with her mother in the streets, he signaled them, and other times he sent her messages with his servants, giving them to the slave woman in my house. So he was constantly trying to seduce this poor woman, and that's the presentation that you would typically have, right? Of trying to argue for a breach of promise case. So instead of believing that rhetoric, maybe we can see other aspects of agency within the case as opposed to just the rhetoric, right? A second type of case is the case of love magic or sorcery, which was was prosecuted by both bishops and the Holy Office at this time, but it was considered very minor. It was not an important criminal act. Women of various races and social statuses cooperated all over Iberia and Spanish America in the early modern era, sharing and selling their knowledge of spells and potions to seduce men. And the inquisitors recorded graphic descriptions of how women use unguents, oils, and bodily secretions of both sexes of many kinds, and rituals and on male bodies to render them sexually compliant. So here's one words to one incantation, which these are all quite similar throughout the Atlantic world. So here's where it starts. Francisco, con dos, te veo, con cinco, beato, so etc. I'll read it in English. Francisco, with 2 I see you, with 5 I draw you in. I drink the blood the heart spills, so that you want me, that you love me, that you die for me. However many women you see, all will look old and ugly. So that's the feas y viejas. Right? So that to me indicates somebody who really wants to get something accomplished, right? And it has this is a mix of African, Spanish, and indigenous lore, commonly practiced by women and some men, especially clerics were specialists in this. Inquisitors lightly punished love magic or ignored it, but sometimes it went a little further and they connected it with their ideas of the devil in the physical world, right? So sometimes it became a more serious crime. And the women involved in these cases had to use extremely complicated manipulations to look for leniency amongst the inquisitors in this situation. So elite women who might be caught up in a more serious case of witchcraft usually had their social status to protect themselves from publicly humiliating punishments. But plebeian love magic practitioners, healers, shamans might find themselves in marching in orderly phase to discourage others from this. So witchcraft was not just this kind of love magic, but dealings with the devil. So in this, just a tiny bit of background, in this era of religious crisis, theologians created the study of demonology in an attempt to prove that the devil was indeed real. And Cartagena had its own minor witch craze in the 1630s, although no one was executed as in other witch crazes. My point in bringing this up is just to bring a couple of case materials to your attention from the Holy Office record from this time period. So the literature of demonology demanded that a true witch had to make a pact with the devil that would be sealed by a heterosexual sex act, most commonly between a woman and a demon in a form of a man. So Cartagena witches kind of had to confess this in order to get reconciled by the Holy Office and hopefully end the whole process, which is a lot more complicated, but you'll have to remember to do that. So when you read their statements made before the Inquisition about witchcraft, they're very formulaic, but they do reveal some things about how they understood desire, sex, and even their fantasy lives, which I know is a reach, but maybe you'll see something here. So for example, there's a freed woman called Paula Egules, and I just use this image because it's a great image for trying to picture a woman, an African woman, Afro-descended woman, and a Spanish woman, kind of how they might have a sort of sensuality and what have you working together. It's meant, that's what this painting's supposed to portray with all the luscious fruits and what have you. So it's not actually Paula, but it's the closest we can have, right? So she said, so thinking of that image of her, maybe in your head, she's talked about a, she confessed to taking part in gatherings of witches, right? And she said in this, on this page, let's see, it's right in the middle, you can see, estampo ardor y fuego, que luego quemas juntas, etc. Right in the middle there with a, what have you, I need a pointer, right? So I translate it as, many times I was incited because of the ardor and fire of these gatherings in Cartagena, but I never let the demon know me carnally, nor did he ask it of me. So she says, I was excited by the fire and passion of these gatherings. So that might be a tiny little word, but it's something, right? And then we have another very strange case involved in this particular round of witchcraft trials, which involved a man of African descent, so there's an image, you can pretend that he kind of looked like that, from the colonial period. He you know, the inquisitors expected, if you were in a witchcraft trial, they expected there'd be a sex act as part of saying that I made a pact with the devil, right? So he kind of got misinformed about what he was supposed to say. And he said, when they put out the candles, I joined, I had sex with my devil, who took me by the back entrance, right? And his devil was in the shape of it's up here a little further, a male dwarf. So this is a very weird, so the inquisitors were like, we were not at all interested in this, and they quickly changed the line of question. So you can just say, like, this was not something normal in this society, right? But and Diego Lopez has like 50 pages of weird things he made up. And so when I present them, it's like, this is this guy's fantasy world. It's so weird, right? Or what is he doing? But, so I just laid out that for the readers. But yeah, it's right there. He took me, you know, very weird. So that's where you can see, because of course one thing that we never talk about is the non-white sexuality, right? Everybody loves to talk about Spanish, aggressive men, and passive women of all races. But what about these guys, right? So that's kind of a more mysterious topic for this time period. So I just wanted to show you some of the rhetoric that give insights into sex and desire and what have you. Using the honor code, the alleged obsession of honorable men with female sexual purity and seclusion frequently seem to be pure verbiage, a rhetorical crutch for men and women looking to advance their side in any given adjudication. I'm not trying to say that the honor code was hollow, but in Cartagena it seemed to function through verbal statements and, as in all places, displays of wealth and piety and public reputation. So I'm trying to change my topic to a broader geographic region and look at professional sex workers for my next topic, because this is something that when I have been working in this field since I was an undergraduate, they never mentioned this. And then as I was looking at archival cases for Cartagena, they never mentioned that such a thing existed. Then I found a very interesting case of a well-known public sex worker, an elite woman called Doña Manuela. And nobody acted like it was anything strange or unexpected or abnormal in any way, shape, or form. So it kind of made me think of what have they been hiding all these years? And what can we find out about this, right? And it might tell us some things. And then, of course, what is our problem that we don't want to see this or talk about this, right? What are we so scared of in presenting this particular aspect of life? So I just started briefly with some archival work this summer. And I thought, I've been looking at the history of emotions. Oh, that's David Lopez, right? And so here's some of the sources, the well-known historians of emotions. They generally take issue with the tradition of the civilizing process, which is saying that our emotions have become more controlled over time, right? More sophisticated, more civilized. And these historians don't agree to that approach. They instead, for example, in the case of Barbara Rosenwein, acknowledge a complex web of overlapping emotional communities that could include family, kin groups, religious institutions, professional, educational settings, etc. And then William Reddy argues for complicating the idea that we are born into an unchanging emotional culture that shapes our every thought and feeling. Although certainly our culture creates emotional expressions and how we show emotions in any way, shape, or form, and even how we think we feel, right? It can change and adapt, and as historians, we should see that there's human agency and there's an interaction between a regime, an emotional regime, and what we do, what we feel. But, you know, they work together, right? So emotional regimes, according to Reddy, can offer a tiny or a broad range of allowable emotional and emotional rhetorical performances, but all emotional regimes penalize those who disregard those regulations. So archival historians using criminal cases, divorce trials, can only examine, as I said, failures in the emotional regime, trying to set right the proper mode of behavior and status and emotional performance. So I'm hoping this will help me a little bit to understand the idea of professional sex workers in this time period. So I hope to cover Mexico City, there's a nice image you guys have seen, other places, Lima, Bogota, wherever I can find that archival resources. So I have to cover quite a long time period given the sparsity of resources. And the lack of cases does not prove that this was not common, but it was that sex work was not common, but that the sex workers and their clients did a great job navigating Spanish-American emotional regimes in regard to sex, honor, and reputation, that they were very much approved, right, and they fit in, right? This is partially due to the fact that what we would call prostitution was actually legal until 1623. And after that, it was tolerated. It was actually a crown monopoly. You could buy the brothel monopoly and open a brothel in a town and have revenue. And that was actually something that they documented. The Catholic kings, Ferdinand and Isabella, did various places. So they were really Catholic, right? They had a different idea of morality, sex, religion than we might assume. So I would have to look at cases and say, why is this toleration breaking down? And why would certain officials attack a sex worker or a procureur or procuress at any given moment? What would be the point of doing that? And how do people get back on track through the court? And also, what kind of words are used related to a woman's sexual reputation? And the terminology is generally, these are not polite words, ramera would be the early modern term, or mujer de mala vida, woman of a bad life, quite vague. So the different words that are used, the different descriptions might tell me something about it as well. And always it was neighbors or certain officials that would decide to investigate a particular woman. Why at any particular moment would this be the case? So I have just very briefly a couple of cases. So we have a couple of cases first starting from the 1560s and 70s when The authorities received a couple of complaints about alcahuetes, which is the early modern term for procuresses. Alcahuetes, it's what they were targeting. And I'd show you Philip II here, because this was a time when he was sporadically making some moral reforms, perhaps inspired by the ill-fated deaths of his wives and heirs, you know, an attempt to morally reform to help his situation. Now, the people who were being prosecuted in this time period were not sex workers, but procurers. Procuresses, what we would say, madams and pimps, right, in the slang. Because those are the people that were considered immoral, not the actual women. So usually these women, so you can see it here, where's my pointer? Here's the types of words. Let's see. The alcahueta right there. Encubridora de hombres y mujeres, fornicarios, trayendo y llevando mensajes. Right? So she's a procurer, encubridora, I guess you could say something like a disguiser, hider of fornicating men and women, and a tercera, a third, right, a messenger. So this is a case from 1570. Typically, these women were either married or widows, and they fit the tradition of La Celestina, which is a 1498 very famous Spanish book about a procuress called La Celestina. It was all caught up in magic and what have you. So they're usually about late 30s, early 40s, widows. You know, that's the sort of stereotypical woman who does this kind of thing. In the case of Mexico City, some were Spanish and some were of African descent. They ran establishments where women of various backgrounds met men in private homes or in inns connected to taverns. There were also situations where there seems to be some kind of commodification of sexuality within the family. For example, let's see if I have a Spaniard called Martín de Villasola and his wife entertained a handful of prominent men in their house. Neighbors saw these men providing money for food, having intimate meals with the couple, and even kissing the wife or sleeping in the bed with her, all in the presence of her husband. So it's, to me, this is a very interesting case. There's another example of a Spanish woman called Ana Bautista. She owned a tavern, and witnesses noticed 18 different kind of relationships, couplings going on in her tavern of married and unmarried people, mainly all Spaniards, a lot of them Spanish officials, etc., right? So I think it's interesting because there's one book on prostitution in colonial Mexico, and it basically concludes women were poor, so they had to do these things. But how about saying, in this case, there's no implication of any kind of force. In fact, the women are middle class or upper middle class in every case. So it doesn't seem like explaining it through poverty is actually why they did that, right? That's sort of you could say a sex negative way of presenting it. Maybe we could think of a different perspective on family, monogamy, gender roles that actually totally contradicts the well-worn assumptions that men lived and breathed the honor code that was about female monogamy and male promiscuity, right? Maybe that's the judicial rhetoric that it seems to be. Maybe that it is really judicial rhetoric, and maybe there's something else going on completely in people's daily lives. That's what I'm hoping to find. So so I'll just skip to a couple of the other cases I have just to end. We have a change and an uptick in a lot of prosecutions and suspicions and what have you. I think I would say vaguely, I can suggest that it's sort of a change in socialization, different styles of socializing. So in the late 18th century, we have these dance schools, right? Escuelas de danza, that are, this is a decree against them. They're very bad. The sexes interact there, right? So it's a different type. This wouldn't have existed in an earlier time period. So it's a different type of society. It's a much larger population. There's much more socialization between men and women publicly. It's a much more militarized society. And here's a royal decree about Lenocinio is a word that means literally, sorry to be rude, pimping, but this is about military men who were pimps and how they were subject to regular justice, not military courts. So there was denser urban population, much more militarization, totally different kind of socialization in the late 18th century. So this is sort of a different venue for this kind of activity, which is kind of my vague conclusion at this stage. And we have, lastly, I can show you, thankfully, much better documentation in the late 18th century, where this is every single night, several pages like this were filled out at the local kind of drunk tank, and what was gathering people that were wandering the streets of Mexico City, and 88% of them, another historian has counted all these, were for, let's see if I find the word, drunkenness, ebreo, right? But sometimes you had a case, we found her in a venereal act with a military man, right? So there's a little bit more evidence of trying to patrol and control the situation on the street for the late 18th century. And last archival case, unfortunately I haven't been able to find an example of this, but in the 1780s, there was one of these guidebooks to all the public women in the city. It's very common throughout European cities, right? But of course, in Latin America, we have the Holy Office who confiscated all of those, right? So they made a real strong effort to confiscate all those guidebooks, sadly. So I think they probably succeeded in doing that. So there wouldn't be any examples left, except in some obscure private collection, perhaps. So that's what I'd like to look for, because that would certainly reveal quite a few things there. So we see by the 18th century then evidence of all kinds of different sex work, women working in pulquerias, which are like low-level taverns, famous actresses and courtesans, sex within a family business, and even like our more traditional idea of a brothel where women are working out in a very nice house, several women entertaining several men. So I'm just starting on this project, and I think I can see a change over time in terms of morals and situations, social situations that would be available. But basically what I'm trying to argue is what I said, that when we look at the honor code, that's not going to reveal too much in terms of people's actual behavior. And we should probably fully agree that it's just a rhetorical stance for the courts, and not necessarily, we can't really learn too much from it in terms of sexual morality, especially when it comes to professional sex work. So I have to leave you in a kind of hanging there, and you have to wait until I'm able to read my cases more in the next few years. So thanks for your patience, and welcome any questions.